All right. Good evening, everyone. I have 6 o'clock on my end, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Holly Grand, and I work with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's Coastal Fisheries Division, and I will be facilitating our webinar here this evening. Before we get started, I do just want to go over a few reminders. Your cameras, microphones, the chat, all of that is going to be disabled during the webinar today. If you have any questions at all during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature that's located at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. It looks like two little chat bubbles there. You can type your questions in at any point during the webinar, but we are going to be answering all of those questions at the end. But again, you can put them in there at any point. If you would like to provide comments about the proposed mariculture site that we're talking about here tonight, you have to email our mariculture email address, which is oyster.mariculture@tpwd.texas.gov. We are not going to be taking any comments through Zoom here tonight. Tomorrow, you will be receiving a follow-up email from Zoom with information with that email address, contact information, if you would like to provide input. There will also be a link to the recording that we have here tonight too, or to our YouTube page anyway, that will have the link posted to watch later. So I think that's everything that I really wanted to cover. So I'm going to hand it over to our presenter here this evening, Zach.
All right, thanks, Holly. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Can you see that, Holly? See me, hear me?
Sorry, no. I had myself muted.
Okay, you can hear me and see.
I can hear you, but I don't, yeah, your screen's not up yet.
Oh, okay, let's give it a second here. I think it's just.
All right, and I see something now.
Oh, hold on, let me. Sorry about that, guys. All right, sorry about that. Okay, well, thank you all for coming in, tuning in tonight. My name is Zach Olson. I'm the ecosystem leader for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Coastal Fisheries Division in the Aransas Bay system. And tonight, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a proposed cultivated oyster mariculture grow-out facility in Aransas Bay. Before we kind of jump into everything tonight, I just want to talk a little bit about the order of operations we're going to be talking about tonight. So I'd like to start out just by giving some general background on oyster mariculture in Texas. This is still a fairly new program, and I understand that a lot of folks may not have a total understanding of what it is. So you just want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Then we're going to talk specifically about the proposed grow-out facility in Aransas Bay. We're going to talk about the location of that site. We're going to talk about the proposed operations at that site. And then we're going to talk about a natural resources survey that the applicant has conducted on that site. And then finally, we're just going to reiterate that information that you would need to provide public comment if you choose to do that. So to get started, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department started accepting applications for cultivated oyster mariculture in September of 2020. To be clear, this is off-bottom oyster mariculture. So what that means is that there are floating bags or cages placed in the water column in this permitted area that we're talking about tonight. And then oysters are allowed to grow to a harvestable size in that water column. So these are not wild oysters. These aren't oysters coming from wild reefs. These are oysters that come from hatcheries or nurseries that are stocked into these floating bags or cages. And then these oyster cages and oysters themselves are actually worked and cleaned in a variety of ways to produce a valuable product for market. So the applicants actually nominate sites that they are interested in permitting. And so throughout a consultation process and through a natural resource survey, we've come to tonight where the applicant we will propose this site and get any public comment that anybody has about this proposed location. Just give you an idea of what some types of gears and what some of these sites could look like. We'll talk specifically about this proposed site here in a couple minutes, but just give you an idea, there are a number of gears that can be used for oyster mariculture, including floating cages, floating bags, adjustable long line systems. And then the TPW permit for oyster mariculture, it has a 10-year term. There's an annual fee associated with that site, depending on the size of the site. However, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department is not the only agency involved in permitting these oyster mariculture locations. There's a number of other state and federal agencies that have authority over various aspects of oyster mariculture, and these include the General Land Office, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and U.S. Coast Guard. And so after tonight, after this site actually passes a public hearing, the applicant would then be given a conditional permit, and that conditional permit does not allow that applicant to do oyster mariculture at that time. What that conditional permit does is it allows that applicant to then go to these other agencies and to fulfill their various requirements, their permits, their leases, whatever their authority covers. We do have an active use criteria for our fully permitted sites, and that is we require a minimum number of oysters to be stocked on site per year. We have very strict biosecurity protocols for these sites, including the fact that only Eastern oyster from Texas brood stock can be stocked on these mariculture sites. And however, because this is not wild harvest, we do allow for year-round harvest out of mariculture sites. However, these applicants still must comply with all Texas Department of State Health Services regulations when it comes to harvesting those oysters. So let's talk specifically about the site that we're talking about tonight. So this proposed site, the permit number is G-0004. All that stands for, the G is the fact that it's a grow out facility, and the 4 is the fact that this is the 4th application we've received. So this is an oyster grow out facility, and what that means is that this proposed site would stock oysters from a hatchery or a nursery and then grow them to market on site. It's located in Aransas Bay, and for those of you familiar with shellfish harvest areas, it's TX30, which is in approved waters, and the total size of the proposed site is 4 acres. So I'll kind of show a map now, just to give you an idea of exactly where this is located. The map to the left is a map of Aransas and Copano Bay. You kind of see that orange star located just off of Blackjack Peninsula. That's the location of this proposed site. The map to the right zooms in a little bit. The blue box is the 4-acre proposed site, and it sits about 2,700 feet from the shoreline, from Blackjack Peninsula. That's a little bit over a half mile off of Blackjack Peninsula, which is owned by the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. So we do require our applicants to provide their access routes, those routes that they would be accessing these sites from. So we have 3 potential access routes here. For those of you familiar with this area, access route 1 just begins at Seagun Marina and runs across Aransas Bay to the site. You can see down kind of in the bottom right-hand corner of that map. Access route 2 begins at St. Charles Public Boat Ramp, and then runs down St. Charles Bay into Aransas Bay. Then access route 3 really just starts at South Copano Causeway Boat Ramp, runs through Copano Bay and then into Aransas Bay. So we're going to look at a couple of different site layout maps. So this first site layout is kind of an above view of the proposed site. The black box is really just the 4-acre proposed site. The small boxes inside are cages, kind of lined up there. So these cages have a maximum dimension of dimensions of 2 foot by 3 foot by 6 foot. So, I'm sorry, 5 foot. So 24 inches by 36 inches by 60 inches. They are lined up in lines of 12. And at the end of each line, we have a helical anchor. It's a little over 6 foot by 10 inches. It's holding each of those rows in place with a 5 by 11 inch orange PV style buoy. So these cages are oriented such that there are in lines of 12, 3 total lines on the long axis of the site, 13 total lines on the short axis, for a total of 426 maximum number of cages on the site. The spacing we're talking about here is 8 foot between cages in each row and 25 feet between each row. So this next map we're going to be looking at is a kind of cross-sectional view. And the main thing I want you to see here, this is a view of a single 12 cage row. You can see those buoys, the helical anchors on each side. The main thing I want you to see here is this main line that's connecting each of those 12 cages, and that's ultimately what's connected to each of those helical anchors. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the specific gear type to be used in this proposed site. So the applicant has proposed to use, this is a proprietary name, but Oyster Grow high flow cage 6-bag system. Again, max of 468 cages on the site, again, anchored to the bay bottom with a little over 5-foot helical anchors, 3/4 propylene anchor line, orange PVC buoys marking the end of each one of those lines. Additional navigational markers. So U.S. Coast Guard is one of the agencies that the applicant will have to visit with and get a ruling on for any additional markers that are required, but any additional U.S. Coast Guard requirements the applicant will need to fulfill. Then the applicant is proposing to use a bird deterrent system, actually 2 possible bird deterrent systems. The first is what's just called bird away hawk system, which is essentially a kite at the end of a pole. And the second is really just using large zip ties to create spikes on the cages. And the main purpose of bird deterrence on oyster mariculture is to keep birds from landing and defecating on those cages that could impact the oysters. We'll show some pictures of those here in a second. So what we have here is just a schematic of the Oyster Grow cage system. You can see this is a cage system on top with a kind of a ballast on the bottom that will float the cages either in the water column or at the surface. So there's really 3 orientation to these cages. We have this feeding position in which the cages are floated in the water column. We have a flipped position that allows those cages to reach the surface and to dry or desiccate. And then we have this submerged position, which is really there for any sort of, in case these cages need to be sunk because of tropical activity, tropical storm, hurricanes in the area to keep from losing gear. So bird deterrent, so the 2 bird deterrents we spoke about. On the left, you see the zip ties being used to keep birds from landing on those cages. And then this hawk system, this pole with a kite on the end of it. So these are the 2 bird deterrent systems that the applicant has proposed to use. So just a little bit about on-site operations. So the applicant has indicated they would access the site at least twice a week, but likely up to daily access during high production harvest. So the floating cage system would be used for flipping those oysters for desiccation. Any gear requiring pressure washing would be taken off site and done on privately owned land away from the water. And then oysters would be tumbled or sorted as needed, either on the vessel, on site, or on land, weather dependent. We do require a hurricane plan for these facilities, and the applicant has a 3-level approach to their hurricane plan, depending on whether there's a storm in the Gulf, whether there's a hurricane watch, or whether there's a hurricane warning. But by and large, this boils down to sinking cages in a serious hurricane situation. And then post-storm recovery would include refloating cages, inventory, and reporting any sort of missing gear. So we'll kind of switch gears now and go to the natural resource survey that we require of all applicants at their proposed site. And the main purpose of these natural resource surveys is just to determine if there's any potential for seagrass or oyster habitat impact. So our requirements as a department are that these sites need to have a 200-foot buffer to any seagrass habitat and a 500-foot buffer from any oyster habitat. And so what these natural resource surveys look like, and I'll show you a map on the next slide, but these are essentially transects, and at each transect, there's a core sample taken, which shows any sort of surface habitats, or we dig into the core because they're interested to know if there's any sort of seagrass or rhizomes that are really just inactive at the moment that could later on, become active seagrass meadows. So this survey was conducted about the early April timeframe. So it was done across a 10-day period. A 4-inch diameter PVC was used to collect those cores. You can see some pictures of what those cores look like at the bottom. During the survey, the depth range on this site was 5.5 to 6.5 feet. And the sample composition was pretty similar across the site, anything from hard pack to soft mud. There were 2 single seagrass rhizomes discovered in 2 individual cores. One was approximately 422 foot from the site. One was about 550 feet from the site. In either case, this is outside of our required seagrass buffer. And regardless, it's pretty minimal and doesn't really suggest there's any sort of seagrass habitat in the area. This is a map of the actual natural resource survey sample points. So you can see that those sample points, we require a denser array of sample points actually on the site itself, and then within a 500-foot buffer, a slightly less dense sample sample array. So you can kind of see also here we have marked the 2 sites that we actually found single seagrass rhizomes. So again, this survey really suggests that there's no oyster or significant seagrass habitat on this site or on the required buffer. And then to finish up tonight, I just want to again reiterate that if you're wanting to submit public comment, you need to do that via email at the website that's given here. I'll finish with a slide tonight that keeps that email up for a while. So if you don't have a chance to write it down right now, you get a chance to do that in a second. But that's oyster.mariculture@tpwd.texas.gov. The deadline for public comment is Wednesday, July 7th, 2022 at close of business, so 5 p.m. So like I said before, if this site passes this public hearing portion of the permitting process, they'll be issued a conditional permit. And that conditional permit, it doesn't allow for mariculture itself. It just then allows that applicant to then go and receive the authorizations and permits and leases they need from other state federal agencies. So that permit is good for 1 year. Once the applicant secures those other state and federal authorizations, they will come back to Parks and Wildlife. If everything's in order, then we'll issue that final mariculture permit. As always, if anybody has any additional questions that they don't get answered tonight about oyster mariculture, you can visit our website, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's website. We have a really good oyster mariculture page on there that has a lot of good information about the program and about any other pending oyster mariculture sites on the coast. So I'm going to leave this slide up for a little while. This is just the oyster mariculture address. If you want to submit public comment, this is where you do it. And so that said, I'm going to go ahead and open this up for any questions that anybody has. So again, we'll be taking questions via your question answer window. You can see that, I believe, at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, feel free to write those in that question answer window and we'll go ahead and get those answered.
Hey, Zach. It looks like the chat is still open, so go ahead and it looks like we had something in there.
Okay, let me see here. So the company name is the Blackjack Point Oyster. What is it? I want to say Blackjack Point Oyster Company. That's the company that's submitting this application tonight. Any other questions?
I do just want to mention that I had to find the security settings. Sorry about that, about the chat. So the chat is now off and you do have to use that Q&A feature that's at the bottom. So again, that it says Q&A and there's 2 little chat bubbles.
Leave it open for a couple minutes in case anybody. Okay, so we have a question here. How long would you anticipate approval from other agencies? It really just depends. We've seen it take up 6 months plus to get through approval for other agencies, but it really just depends on specifics of the site and that sort of a thing. Any other questions? So it says, what is required for this proposal to pass this stage of the process and move forward? Yeah, so really what we're just looking for tonight is any sort of concern from local members of the public or constituents that they might have about the location of the site, given other folks' use of the bay. And so really we would, if we had a lot of public outcry about a particular location in the bay, we felt that was warranted, we may work with the applicant to move the site to help avoid any sort of user conflict. And yeah, sorry, another question on there was, who are the principals involved in the LLC? We're not going to be releasing the names of the individuals tonight, but I can release the name of the company. So another question, do you have any concerns about gear selection for this particular site? No, I don't think we have any concerns. This is actually a pretty common gear. I know at least one of our other currently active mariculture sites in Texas is using the same gear. It seems to be working well for them. So yeah, we don't really have any concerns about this sort of gear for this site, no. So another question, is positive public comment required for the permit to pass? No, not necessarily positive public comment, but really we're looking for any issues that may have may arise from the general public that we just kind of missed or are not aware of. So positive comment isn't required, but if there was negative comment, we would certainly take that into account. I'll give it just another minute or so, see if anybody has any questions they want to type in the question answer box. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. In the meantime, if anybody has any questions that they think about after the public hearing tonight, and they are wanting to get those answered, you can also send any questions to that oyster.mariculture@tpw.texas.gov email address, and we can get those answered that way as well. I'm going to turn it back over to Holly. Thank you guys for tuning in tonight.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you, Zach. And again, as another reminder, you will be getting a follow-up email from Zoom tomorrow, where you will have, again, that email address, the Oyster Mariculture email address, along with a link to our YouTube page where you can view this recording later if you'd like to review it for anything. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and end our webinar here. Thank you again, everyone, so much for joining us this evening.